We are one in the Spirit. We are one in the Lord. Sad to say, I guess we cannot, if we ever could, assume that people will know we are Christians by our love. All right? That's sad to say. I was reading a statistic yesterday from a study done with 16 to 29-year-olds, a majority of whom strongly agree that Christianity is anti-homosexual, judgmental, and hypocritical. And only 16% would strongly agree that Christianity is a faith they respect or that Christians consistently show love for other people. 16 to 29-year-olds, 16% of whom think that they will not know that we are Christians by our love. As I said last week, optics matter. If we love people, we better look like it. Not the pretense of loving people, but the practice of it, no matter how incomplete or how imperfect it might be. We are one in the Spirit, we sing this morning, and we're echoing Barbara Gibson's version of Psalm 24. The earth is one, and all that live in it is one. Now, if you're here on one of the evenings of Shabbat, when the Bet Aleph Meditative Synagogue is worshiping in this space, you would probably hear Rabbi Olivier refer to God as the oneness of being. Any of you been to Bet Aleph? Is that not what he says? The oneness of being, which makes sense, given that the central tenet of Judaism is Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And our sisters and brothers at Bet Aleph understand that the oneness of God is that essential connection we share with each other and with the world. That is, the oneness of God. That's basically the meaning we get from Barbara Gibson's version of this psalm when she says, the earth is one and all that live in it are one. Now you also heard the standard version of Psalm 24, beautifully sung for us this morning. The earth is the Lord's, and all who dwell in it. The earth belongs to God. And the writer says, one of the writers says, this is God's ultimate ownership of all things. You may remember that story in Matthew 22 where Jesus is ambushed by the questions of the religious leaders. Have you ever been ambushed by a question? It happened to Jesus all the time. By the religious leaders. And their question is about taxes. Now, there's a question all by itself. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? They ask. The trap is that if Jesus says, yes, it is lawful, he aligns himself with those in power who are complicit with the oppression of Rome. Those folks who are making a really good living by cozying up to the Romans. If he says no, he risks aligning himself with those who advocate the violent overthrow of the government. So instead, Jesus asks for a coin and identifies that the coin bears the image of Caesar, which is already a problem, right? You know the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt make no graven images. So we're already in risky territory here. And then Jesus says those famous words, give unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Now everyone standing in that crowd knows Psalm 24, right? The earth is the Lord's, and all who live in it, everything belongs to God. So this model of God as the ultimate owner of the world serves an important purpose. Jesus is saying, Caesar may think that he owns the world, but he does not. The earth belongs to God. We may think we own the world, but we do not. The native ancestors of this place knew better, right? The speech attributed to Chief Seattle says, "How can we sell the air? How can we sell the land? How can we sell we don't own it!" So the model of something or someone greater than us owning the world serves an important purpose, but Gibson's adaptation shifts the language of ownership to relationship. From the earth belongs to God to we belong to each other, and each other in this oneness of being. Now, maybe you've noticed that belonging straddles both meanings, right? Both ownership, we have belongings, and relationship, we belong. And in case you're guessing that this is the point in the sermon where I say, of course, possessions, bad. Relationships, good. I'll simply say that sometimes it's hard to tell if we own our possessions or if our possessions own us. Amen? Sometimes it's hard to tell. And I do want to recognize that our belongings can sometimes be an expression of belonging. I was reading a very heartfelt article by Mark Libano. Mark, I know Mark, at least at a distance, and I have known his family for some time. He married into the McNair family. His article is called Artifacts. And it's about the sudden death of his wife at age 40. Shocking. And the comfort and the struggle of seeing the things that belong to her all around him. Those things aren't about ownership. Everywhere I look, there is something else that stabs me with a happy memory, he writes. Then, when we can no longer bear the memories, we throw their possessions out and our dead die again. Some of you know what this is about, right? There is that closet full of memories, and then you give everything away, and that empty closet becomes an expression of the emptiness that you are feeling. See, sometimes belongings are more than possessions. They're artifacts of a relationship. They remind us that we belong. Perhaps the lesson here is that the things we presume to own derive whatever meaning or value they have from the relationship, the belonging they represent. This building, for instance, it's beautiful, right? It's beautiful and it's useful, but its meaning and its value is an artifact of the belonging that we are working to acknowledge and to create. It's a tribute to the relationship we have with our ancestors and with one another and our future. It's an artifact, a tribute. And if belonging can straddle ownership and relationship, we should be clear that however meaningful belongings can be, they are never people. Amen? We do not own one another. We belong to each other. I used to hear kids say when they were asked to do something they didn't want to do, "You don't own me." Yeah. "You're not the boss of me. You don't own me." Well, that's right. And there has been a lot of damage that has been done when people get confused about belongings and belonging, when they mix up ownership and relationship. I've started reading a book I bought to be part of my dissertation that I only now have discovered that I bought for my dissertation, which is now done. It's a follow-up to Diana Butler Bass's reordering of the traditional pattern of church. We've talked about this before. The old model was believing, behaving, belonging. Believe the right thing, behave the right way, and then maybe you can belong. Bass says that order doesn't help us very much. And the better order of things is belonging, behaving, believing. First, we commit to belong, and then we figure out how to do that. And only then do we discover what it is that we believe. Here's the problem. I believe this. I think it is true instinctively. But that's different than knowing how to do it intentionally. So I'm reading this book, A Church Beyond Belief by William Sachs and Michael Boss, about how it is that we learn to belong. And for those of you who are fans of Brene Brown, any of you fans of Brene? If you have never looked at one of her TED Talks, go home. It's better than the sermon. Go home and look up Brene Brown, and you will be interested to know that she is often quoted in this book. In fact, in the book she says, we are psychologically, emotionally, cognitively, and spiritually hardwired for connection, love, and belonging. It's why we're here. And it's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. It's why we're here. So, how do we do it? I believe it. How do we do it? Now, the first thing we have to do, she says, is to figure out the difference between fitting in and belonging. You get the distinction between those two things? Fitting in versus belonging. You know, I spent a whole lot of years of my life doing the best I could to fit in. And you know what? It almost killed me. Belonging, on the other hand, is two things. One, longing to be seen for who you really are. And two, longing to be part of something larger than yourself. In order to do the first thing, we have to be open to that difficult thing called human vulnerability. And those of you who pay attention to Brene Brown, you know that's at the center of how she understands the world. Be vulnerable. I have to say that I have heard it said, it is not a real sermon until I do what? It's not a real sermon until Tim... And I've talked a lot about this, right? I hate that. You all are so nice and so supportive and tell me how important it is. I hate it. I resist it with all my being, and it just happens. And see, I used to think that it was about me. But I'm beginning to wonder if it's as much about you as it is about me. That is, the belonging work that we're trying to do in our life together makes those tears possible. It's okay to be vulnerable. And I know I'm not alone in this because I know some of you cry too. Amen to that. So the first part of this belonging is the longing to be seen just as we are, the work of being vulnerable with each other. The second part is about longing to be part of something bigger than ourselves. You probably know all the ways that belonging can go wrong, right? People become completely focused on themselves. Navel-gazing, we call it. Their willingness to be vulnerable becomes scary, and so they draw the circle of their connections ever tighter to protect themselves. They become insulated and exclusive. But the adaptation of Psalm 24 reminds us this morning that the earth is one and all that is in it. We don't just belong to each other, we belong to something greater. We belong to the earth and all that lives in it. The book reminded me of the story of William Wilberforce. Does that name sound familiar? The later 1700s. If you saw the movie Amazing Grace, he's an important part of that story. He belonged to a small group of Christians committed to justice and the abolition of slavery. In that group, Wilberforce had an awakening, or we might say today, he got woke. Amen to that. He got woke. And he felt confronted with a sense of our common humanity, and not just a recognition of that, oh yes, we're all connected, whether we're people of color or slave or free or privileged or poor. He got woke to a profound sense of responsibility for that relationship and who he is in that relationship. By the belonging he experienced in that smaller group, he woke up to that larger connection we have with all people, and he spent the rest of his life using his privilege and his resources to fight poverty and to abolish slavery. He galvanized the anti-slavery movement in England, and the Slavery Abolition Act was passed by the British Parliament in 1833. Wilberforce died 3 days later. He gave his life. By the way, he also was one of the founders of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Think about that. In other words, the practice of belonging woke Wilberforce up to all the ways that we are connected with each other and the world. So when people ask me why they should join the church, I say it's not about joining this church or any church. It's about the practice of belonging. It's about learning to do that important work of being vulnerable with each other and waking up to that larger connection and that responsibility we have for the relationship with other people and the world. A couple weeks ago, we were at the rally, the immigration rally, and I had to ask myself, why are Native Americans showing up at an immigration rally? You can't catch the irony of it? They're the only people in the crowd who aren't immigrants. Why are they there? Because they know what it is to be vulnerable and how things can get messed up when we confuse ownership with relationship. Why do busy people show up at families belong together events? Because they see just how vulnerable children and parents are in a system that cannot tell the difference between our common humanity and the boundaries we have constructed, the borders we have constructed. Why do we show up here on a Sunday morning? Sure, the building is beautiful, and there are lots of good things that happen here, but this building is an artifact of something more. Its value and its meaning come from the work we do in here to belong to the world out there. And sad to say, people may not assume that we are Christians by our love. But that should not stop us. That shouldn't keep us from living the awareness that we are one in the Spirit and loving the world anyway. We cannot own the sunlit sky, the song says, for we are part of all that is. It's not about ownership. It's about relationship. It's about learning how to belong to one another in the world. And beloved ones, belonging may be the most beautiful and the most difficult thing that any of us will ever do. So today, if you hear that voice, if you hear that echo whispering in your soul, we are one. We are one. If you hear that voice, for God's sake, for your sake, for the world's sake, do not harden your heart.